after the forum as well. So welcome all. My name is Katie Holland. I think I've seen most people on the call at some point as we've moved through this forum series. So thanks for being here. We had some technical difficulties with our last session. There was a nationwide Zoom outage that conveniently occurred at the same time as our session. So that session was recorded and is available on the website if you did miss that, which was section 3, the identify focus areas section of the wheel. So that's available on the Road to Recovery website. I can share that link at the end of the session, and that's where you'll find this one moving forward as well. So today we're looking at the fourth section of the wheel, which is identify challenges. We've now moved from the top of the wheel all the way to the bottom. And this section is a really interesting one for conversation. So I'm hoping, especially because we have a smaller group today, that we will be able to have some discussion around some of the topics that come up in this section of the wheel. But I do love for these presentations to be conversational. So feel free to speak up as you have comments, questions, and thoughts. So as I've mentioned in previous sessions, this recovery wheel tool is meant to be collaborative. So our collaborative team with Road to Recovery has produced this tool, but we're sharing it with the broader species working group and bird conservation community in the hopes of gaining your input and insights into this tool and how it can be made most useful for species recovery and specifically by specific species working groups. So with that, we will dive in. So like I said, today we're focusing on section 4, which is identify challenges. And this is part 4 of a 6-part series that's moving through the entire recovery wheel from top all the way around to top again. So today we'll focus and reflect on this section, and I'll give some orientation as to where we are in the wheel for context as we move into the specific criteria that are included in this section. And so, as I assume most of you have seen at this point, this is the format of our recovery wheel. So we have each of the 6 action categories is divided into 3 segments. Those segments each have 5 criteria. So it makes up a total of 90 criteria going around the wheel. If you download the Excel sheet from our website, you'll see, this is just a screenshot of the Excel sheet, but you'll see the criteria on the left. Next to them, there's comments. And then if you scroll further through that Excel sheet, there's space for your your working group recovery team to add your own thoughts and comments as you work through it in relation to your species. So this is the recovery wheel. We started at the top with organized action as the first segment in this 6-part series. We've moved now to the bottom. We are at identify challenges. And as I mentioned, each of the segments that you see, the lines has 5 boxes going from the center of the wheel out to the outside. Those are the criteria. We'll review those today, and they're meant to progress 1 through 5, moving from the inside of the wheel to the outside. We've learned through these sessions and through conversations with working groups who have used this tool that though our intention is for those to progress around the wheel and from the inside out, that doesn't always happen in reality. And so we love to hear exactly how these different segments and criteria are applying to the work that you all are doing in your working groups, particularly those who maybe have been doing work for a while and then have taken on this tool to assess progress and where you are. So please share those insights with us either today or in a follow-up with our team. And these are the 1 through 5, as I mentioned, that you'll see as we move through the specific criteria for today. We score progress on all of these criteria using a 0, 1, and 2 system. So 0 in the spreadsheet would mean that there has been no progress on that particular criteria to date. 1 meaning some progress has been achieved, and 2 meaning the working group feels like they have achieved the needed progress on that criteria. And as you move around and add in those 1s, 2s, and 0s, it will color code the wheel color in all of these different segments around the wheel to give a visual representation of the progress for recovery of the species. So for today, we're down at the bottom in this orange section, identify challenges. And I thought it would be useful before we dive into this section to give just a brief reminder of where we're coming from. So last month when we did section 3, action category 3 is identify focus areas. The segments within action category 3 were demographics, focus areas, and local knowledge. And so we went through all the criteria of those. And I talked a lot about the need to build that everything within that action category 3 was building towards talking about broader threats and talking about limiting factors. And that's where we're going today. We talked about the relationship between thinking about broader, like regional landscape levels, thinking about more specific focus areas that are habitat levels, and then how we integrate talking about threats and limiting factors into those things. And so today we'll really explore the relationship between threats and limiting factors and how those two can combine to inform our recovery goals and our prioritization of needs for the species. The one on the right side is where we're going next, so I'm going to come back to that after we move through the criteria here. So we will jump into it. This section has 3 segments, as all of them do. So today we're going to talk about habitat and ecology first. Then we'll move into landscape challenges. And finally, our third segment in the identify challenges section is limiting factors, which if I have learned anything in my time with Road to Recovery, it is how much we love to discuss limiting factors. So we will save plenty of time for that conversation today and gaining all of your insights and how your working groups are addressing that process of identifying limiting factors. And so one thing that comes up a lot in our conversations with Road to Recovery and recovering tipping point bird species is this conversation about landscape scale approaches to avian conservation and species-specific approaches to avian conservation. And I think this section of the wheel, it's hard to pick a favorite section of the wheel, but this one is up there for me because I feel that I have this conversation with people so often about how these two approaches have to come together, right? That they're both critically important for species recovery. We don't really see how we can do single species recovery without thinking about landscape scale approaches. And our goal with Road to Recovery is to focus intentionally and directly on tipping point bird species. And this section of the wheel really walks the walk, so to speak, to that talk about how these approaches can be integrated and inform each other. And so before I dive into the criteria here, I just wanted to give a quick orientation to the terminology that I'll use and that we've chosen to use in describing the criteria in the wheel. And just as with last time with section 3, the terminology that we're choosing, we acknowledge that groups use these terms differently internally, and that their relationships can be described in a lot of different ways. And so this orientation is to give context to the way I'm using the terms in this conversation today about these specific criteria in this section of the wheel. But if your working group is approaching these terms and their relationships differently, that would be something that would be really beneficial for us to discuss and hear about today. So thinking about landscape level and landscape scale, here in the wheel, we're really focusing there on threats at that landscape regional scale. And what are the big threats that are having an impact on the landscapes that the specific species we're focusing on is needing. And then on the species scale and species focus side, we're able to take an examination of those threats and move more specifically to limiting factors. And so last time I used Baird sparrow as an example here. And we can think about that same example in just highlighting the relationship that we're using in the wheel. The grassland loss, habitat loss grassland loss would be the landscape scale threat for that sparrow species, the Baird sparrow species. Um, and then if we think about it more specifically, really looking at the focus areas that we talked about last time, you can have grassland loss for many different reasons. And so in order to get down to a limiting factor for the specific species, we have to move into what are the causes. So we can lose grassland for land conversion to agriculture, from woody encroachment. So thinking about where within that landscape do we need to focus, and how does that threat scale down to that specific habitat level? And so an example of that difference would be thinking about grassland habitat loss and thinking about woody encroachment in a particular area that makes the bird more susceptible to predation. That would be moving us towards being able to identify the specific limiting factor at that species level. And so that's the relationship that has guided the creation of these sections of the wheel, and that we'll be kind of thinking about the interplay between those things today as we move through the criteria. Oh, I forgot to click on my little bird when I was giving the example. I was pretty proud of this sparrow. Oh well. Okay, so let's dive into the criteria for these sections, starting with habitat and ecology. And so when we were first talking about designing this forum, it was with the intention of participants being able to use this time, use these recordings with the working groups, to go through and actually score your species. So if you could approach looking at these criteria with that mindset, to make sure that they're making sense, they're applying well to the species, and share with us now or after if you have feedback on how they might need to be tweaked, or how well they're fitting with your species. So habitat and ecology, we start with looking at the breeding and the non-breeding habitats. So again, you see the numbers over here on the side. So that's telling us our position on the recovery wheel. We're starting at 1, which would be the inner part of the circle, and then moving towards 5, which would be the outside part of the circle. Again, with the acknowledgement that we did design these in a way that we thought was progressive from 1 to 5, with the acknowledgement that that's not always how it works in reality for species working groups. And so we've seen many examples where working groups may have 2s in some of the outer criteria, and then are working back to fill in the first and second criteria. So for habitat and ecology, and again, last time we talked about broader landscapes. Here we're talking about habitat scale. And we're looking at, do we have the ecological knowledge about the habitats and the breeding and non-breeding grounds that we need for this species? And you see in the right-hand column, the criteria, some examples of what would be needed. And there may be more, depending on the species, what type of data from an ecological perspective needs to be collected in both the breeding and non-breeding grounds to be able to move forward. And then 3 is one that I know everyone wants to move towards, and there are a lot of challenges, but I've seen a lot of progress with different working groups in moving towards being able to spatially map those breeding and non-breeding grounds, and having the data needed to look at it from a spatial stance. 4 and 5 then build upon that and look at the human components. So what are the anthropogenic factors that are affecting habitat quality? And so we've seen these human dimensions components pop up throughout the wheel. Here, we're really looking at habitat quality. So there are endless human connections, right, to ecology and to habitats. But for this section of the wheel, we're trying to really narrow in our focus on anthropogenic factors that are impacting habitat quality for the species. So thinking about tying it into that ecological data that was collected in 1 and 2 here. Ideally, I think then we're able to add some of that information to the map. So I know this is something, I don't know if we have anyone on today from the Central Grassland Bird Working Group, besides myself. But this is something that group is really interested in mapping, and has made significant progress in being able to map a lot of the ecological components that they're interested in that are impacting grassland bird habitat quality throughout the ranges. And we've been brainstorming for a long time now and are starting to actually do some of the work to gather the human data as well that can contribute to that map. And so I think intuitively creating the GIS map from the ecological, biological data that we have usually comes first. And I think then looking at that map helps us to target specifically where we need to think about anthropogenic factors for habitat quality. Once we do that, then I would personally love to see a loop from 5 to 3 on this section that allows us to integrate some of that data into our mapping to create these prioritization maps for species for habitat ecology and quality. I'll pause pause there for comments, additions from our road to recovery team, questions, or just insights into how this section has worked well or applied to your species. Okay. Stop me if they come up. I'll keep moving because I think that I'm hoping the next two, maybe we will have some discussion around because then we're getting into our threats and then our all-time favorite limiting factors. So landscape challenges here. You see I've added in bold where threats are coming up. So this section is really about threats. So the focus here is on identifying threats. And we're moving towards being able to think about how all of those threats are combining and being able to prioritize the ones that are most important to the species, and then looking for where work on these threats are already being done. So we start at the top at 1, which again is the center of the wheel, looking at broad regional threats identified for the species in the breeding season, and then number 2 in the non-breeding season. And there are tools that exist. The Audubon Threats Map has been really useful to different groups. Using a conservation standards approach has helped with identifying threats. And these are the big types of threats. Like I used the grassland habitat loss as an example, urbanization, habitat conversion for pasture, for cropland. It depends on where you are, but we're thinking about these at a broad regional level. And then we look at, once we've identified what those threats are, and there can be many of them affecting the species. Like I said, we move towards the prioritization piece of it, but identifying what those threats are is the first step. Looking at what the socioeconomic drivers of those threats are. So in the habitat and ecology section, we were looking at anthropogenic factors that affected habitat quality. So a bit more specific to the habitat quality piece. Here we're looking at the threats, in my opinion, more broadly, and we're thinking about what are the actual drivers of those threats. And this is not a quick piece to answer. Don't think this needs to necessarily always be its own independent exploration into this topic. There's a wealth of deep social science knowledge in the literature on values that drive a lot of these big conservation threats, like habitat conversion, urbanization, but trying to approach the threat and understand it from that driver perspective. What are the human pieces that are driving this threat? Is important in being able to eventually get to an addressing the threat piece. Those big pieces like values are important. People's perceptions of the threats are also important. People's perception of their ability to change behaviors is also important, right? I think we talk a lot about behavior change in conservation. The perceived capacity to change a behavior is, in my opinion, equally as important, right? If people believe that they are not able to engage in a certain conservation behavior, that can be a major driver. And so kind of teasing apart those social science, psychological components within a community. And again, that's something that certainly would be exciting to explore with a research project related to any of the species that I know you all work on. But there's a ton of literature and knowledge. So if we can identify where we're thinking, what are the communities, what are we talking about in terms of the types of threats, and specifically where, then we can dive into a body of knowledge about the communities that overlap with those key areas and think about what work has been done on understanding the drivers of those threats. And then we move into looking at the threats that we've identified, refining them, and trying to prioritize them. And again, there are different systems that can be used in this process, but a big piece, which I put in bold, because this is really the one of the things that I find most interesting and also most important in applied conservation work, is understanding the feasibility based on these human dimensions components. So it's one thing to be able to prioritize which threats need to be addressed. And we can do that in a hypothetical landscape, but we don't work in hypothetical landscapes. We work in really messy, complicated landscapes that include a lot of human components. And so thinking about what those human components are and how feasible it is to actually change them is an important piece of the prioritization process when we're thinking about threats. So I think we can work on paper and simultaneously in the messy reality of on the ground conservation, and looking at, from a species perspective, what are the most important threats and where, and then pulling in the human dimensions components. Which of those threats do we have a shot at addressing, or which pieces or which strategies might be the most feasible? Because I think that saves us time, energy, and resources if we can pull on all of that knowledge that exists to be able to do that. And then number 5 for landscape challenges as we work outwards again, is to look at the threats that we've identified and the partnerships that we've identified previously in the wheel. Where are there efforts and campaigns to address these broad threats already? And thinking about that outside of bird-specific efforts. So if one of the threats is urbanization, certainly that's impacting a lot of ecological pieces, including birds and broader than birds. So where are there campaigns that are existing that are working to address some of the priority threats that have been identified? And how can we tap into those opportunities as we build partnerships to think about how all of this will impact our species population and ultimately recovery? So lots of threat focus here and thinking about bigger picture, landscape level challenges. Thoughts, comments, insights on these criteria?
Yeah, Katie, great job explicating this. I think, and you already said this, but I'll stress it's, because we work a lot with single species working groups, it's not the expectation that every working group will address these broad threats. And so stressing the fact that building those partnerships with folks who are actually doing work on a large landscape level is really important. So so the analysis, first of all, sometimes it's just hard to figure out, well, who's working on, who are the big actors who are working on putting grassland on the landscape? Who are the big actors who are working on stabilizing, um, uh, stabilizing the landscape to prevent erosion and or landslides, etc. Maybe there's big reforestation program. Can we intersect with that reforestation program and influence, what tree species are really being used in reforestation by other groups who don't even think about birds? So making sure we know about those things, not necessarily that every working group has to do specific actions at this broad scale is really important. Thank you so much for bringing that to our attention.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. It's a great point. And I think a lot of the working groups have been doing a good job doing that. So if anyone has examples from your own work in your working groups, it would be great to hear them. Ken, go ahead.
Mm. Yeah, just to build on that, I don't know, this might jump ahead, Katie, into your sort of the next section, but in my experience, I think you said this, a lot of groups have already done these broad threats analyses, and they're not necessarily species specific. And so one of the big challenges in thinking about particular species, and that's what the purview of the species working groups is sort of that translation piece from the broad threats to how it's affecting a particular species, because each species has a different response to those threats, and some birds, we call them threats, but some species are increasing in the face of these kinds of changes, and we're focused on the birds that are declining. And so what is it specifically about that threat that's affecting the bird, in your example of the woody encroachment for the Baird sparrow? So I just think that it's easy to get, and Tom said this, that not every working group, is going to be able to deal with urbanization or some of these big threats. But the key part is figuring out how each declining species is interacting with that threat. And I guess that's really what's getting at the limiting factor. But um, anyway, I think there might be some confusion out there in sort of the bird planning world in general about these broader threats analyses, but then why are we still seeing declining species, and how can we tie those threats to the declines themselves is I think a really key step in this process.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Steve, do you have a comment? I saw your.
Yeah, I guess we have a pretty good example of some of this work thinking about trying to tap into groups that are focused on the broader landscape and a threat that is specific to the bird of interest, but also much more of a big picture issue than that. So fire suppression has long been an issue for Kirtland's warbler breeding habitat because fire is required to regenerate the jack pine forest that they rely upon. And there's been various efforts to basically have proxies for fire through clear cut and replanting. But everyone involved recognizes that fire would still be the best option ecologically because there's certain things that fire does in terms of nutrient cycling and creating habitat structure for Kirtland's warbler like snags, but then also good habitat for other species that the plantation approach really can't replicate. And so although we have the 50-year history of the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team, there's a newer initiative called the Northern Pine Plains Partnership, which is bringing together people that are, including some local NGOs that are looking at getting fire back on the landscape and thinking more holistically about, okay, what would an ecosystem and landscape scale approach look like for the region? So they're much more focused on forest management more broadly than just for Kirtland's warbler habitat. So the conservation team has definitely been engaged quite a bit with them, and that gets us connected with some expertise, including like botanists in Michigan that are really concerned about rare plant species that occur in areas, and habitat is created for these rare plants better with fire than with plantation management, for example.
Yeah, it's a perfect example. And fire is such a fascinating topic from a human dimensions perspective too, and I think provides a good example of this feasibility piece because you can say that the best case scenario would be fire across this landscape, but if the communities across that landscape, if there are barriers that are not surmountable in the time frame that the fire needs to happen, then that's a big feasibility issue. And I think just being able to look at those bigger pictures at this landscape scale is really important.
Yeah, absolutely, Katie. One thing I'll add that speaks to that is that the Northern Pine Plains Partnership is explicitly considering the social license to apply fire and what sort of outreach and sort of public education efforts would be needed in order to make something like that happen and happen at a meaningful scale. It's one thing to just do a couple little prescribed burns that are 10, 20 acres, but really annual burning in this ecosystem really needs to be thousands of acres to be effective in terms of an ecological force on the landscape. So yeah, that's something that they're exploring and doing so from very different angles than what we get just focused on Kirtland's warbler. So it's been a really helpful group to engage with.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's like the anti-Smokey the Bear campaign that needs to happen. Yeah, it gets so ingrained, but it's a good example of how complex just the buy-in to these conservation actions can be. And that's an extreme one, but it's that issue and that kind of need for those social campaigns. I know we've been talking about it with the Central Grassland Bird Working Group a lot. It just to get that community level buy-in to really produce the ecological impact that are needed for species. It requires some social things to change within communities, but it can happen. There are good examples of it happening. Maybe that's something that would be fun to pull together for a future R2R session. Other comments on this threat piece or other groups that have similar examples of how you've moved towards tackling this section? The other piece that I'll point out just before moving forward, and we'll talk about kind of as we wrap up this series on the wheel, but this recovery wheel is not designed to be a one-time through the process. It's meant to be iterative. It's meant to be used periodically to assess progress. And with the recognition that landscapes change, threats move, threats change. And so this is a section I think that's important to revisit and reorient on the threats that have been identified, but also the prioritization of them and the impact that they're having on the species as recovery moves forward, to revisit and move through this loop as needed. So moving forward to the third segment in this section, which is focused on limiting factors. And so I think this is moving towards generally what Ken was describing is moving from these threats and thinking then, okay, we've identified these threats at the landscape level, but what is it about that threat that is important to the recovery of this specific bird? And how can we really pinpoint what that is, where it is, when it is, to identify these limiting factors? And so overall, this section, as you move from the inside of the wheel to the outside, it moves from refinement of the threat into a limiting factor hypothesis. And then if you skip ahead to number 5 here, it's that we've identified the limiting factor and feel confident with that identification. So starting with 1, we look at the threat analysis that just happened in the previous section and look at the focus areas that we identified in action category 3. So we talked about that last time, but if you missed that one, you can kind of scroll back to the criteria there for focus areas. But that really concentrated on narrowing in on where we need to be prioritizing action for recovery and looking at how all of those things come together to be able to hypothesize a limiting factor, which is number 2 here for the species. And so being able to move into, okay, it's not just habitat loss, but it's this specific type of woody encroachment, or it's the specific type of land conversion for agriculture in this area. Um, or it's the not only urbanization, but it's the rate of urbanization that the species isn't able to keep up with. So we're trying to refine that threat more specifically for the particular species that we're focusing on. And then the third one, once we have that hypothesis of what a potential limiting factor for the species might be, we look at the socioeconomic pieces that are related. And so in the previous section, we're looking at feasibility of actions. We're looking at anthropogenic factors that impact in section 4.1, which was habitat and ecology. We talked about how do anthropogenic factors impact habitat quality specifically. So we're pulling all of that together, but now we're really looking at what are the human dimensions components of this particular threat that we're discussing that are relevant to the species. And so that really hones in on where we're focusing and what we're focusing on. So if it's the rate of urbanization across a particular landscape, what are the drivers of not just urbanization there, but how quickly it's happening? What would slow it down? Is it economic drivers? Is it change in livelihood, majority livelihood in that area? Is it people moving? What are the social pieces of that? And it would depend on which landscapes you're talking about, what those are. But again, the focus now is really tying those human dimensions components of the specific threat to the specific species. And so we're just kind of refining closer and closer, more and more narrow to be able to identify as specifically as we can impactful limiting factors for the species. And then the fourth one here is that local and traditional ecological knowledge are included. And that can be through partners that we've identified previously in the wheel. That can be through knowledge that exists in different formats, including published knowledge, but including other sources of knowledge from particular focal areas that may have been defined in the previous section for the species. But what is known, because a lot of information is not held in the formats that we typically access through Google Scholar. And so can we think more broadly and work with partners to make sure that we're accessing as much information about these threats, the human components of the threats, and then the impact that these are having on species in all parts of the range. But I think this will be most important in parts of the range where we don't have as much published social science knowledge available. And the partnerships that we've established within the working group through working through the first sections of the wheel are really critical for being able to have access to the knowledge and be able to understand the knowledge that's needed for this criteria here. And then number 5, being able to input a 2 into the wheel spreadsheet for number 5 would mean that as a working group, you agree that the limiting factor has been identified and refined to a scale that allows for the working group to start targeted conservation action, and then also to monitor the impact of that action on the species and be able to move towards an adaptive research approach where we're integrating or implementing actions and we're assessing the impact. And we feel good about moving towards that implementation because we feel strongly that we've identified the right issue to be addressing. And that is our limiting factors section, which I know you all have comments and thoughts on. It sounds easy, right? This is one that I think, at least in my head, logically flows really well. It makes a lot of sense how this progression would happen, and the actual working through it and getting to that point is a real challenge. I think it requires a lot of persistence and it also requires resources. But I know from speaking to a lot of working groups that getting towards this identifying the limiting factor in number 5 has been a priority, and a goal. And so I think a lot of the work that happens in the other sections, we talked about at the beginning of the last session how the identify focus areas section was really working to build towards this component, being able to say, yes, we've identified a limiting factor that we can now target with conservation action. And I know that that's a priority within all of this for many of the groups. Well, I don't know who was first. Ken, I think you were first in my top corner.
Well, who, if there's a real person from a working, oh,
Oh, it's
that's,
just
oh,
Tom.
just Tom. Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry. I
Not a real person.
was just going to throw out a comment about the last thing you were saying because just today, I happened to meet up with Jim Sirocco from Institute for Bird Populations, who's visiting Cornell, and they're working on integrating maps and eBird data into IPM models. And so I just know because we had a whole workshop. I think some of the folks on here were might have even been presenters in one of those earlier workshops about. So this is the part of the whole thing that really requires a lot of data that we don't often have. And so it sort of brings up, it's not just a how do you do it, but it's where are we going to get the data for a particular species and demographic data in particular. So there are groups working on um, knowing that it's really hard and expensive to get targeted demographic data, on a species by species basis, how can we tap into some of these broader programs that are getting a lot of data on multiple species and be able to use that information in the modeling necessary for these um, tipping point species? So anyway, I just thought that might stimulate some discussion because it's a whole area of endeavor is collecting the data and working on these models, and the techniques keep changing and improving. So, yeah, maybe some of the species folks can comment on that as well.
And I'd be interested too in how those of you working in species working groups have placed the bar of moving from like this is a hypothetical to we feel we've identified this, and what's the level of data quality that you need to get to that point, or how are you making the decision of when you feel good enough to move towards action, or how those pieces come together for that prioritization. Tom?
Yeah, I don't know. I'll make my comment, but I also I'd be interested in hearing the answer to your question. I just wanted to comment that it's a really interesting section because we talk about a limiting factor as if there were only one, but implicit in the definition of limiting factors that we've been talking about, that is the fact that they tend to operate at smaller scales for many species, particularly with a species that has a broad range and can occupy a number of different quote unquote habitats or habitat types, or it may be responsive to subtle changes in different habitats in different geographies. There may be, the link between the focus area and the limiting factor is really important. So limiting factors can be different in different places. And so I think it's hard to identify a limiting factor, but recognizing the fact that they may be slightly different in different parts of the bird's range or geography or non-breeding versus breeding season is really critical. And also that nature of iteration, which is necessary, identifying today's limiting factor and dealing with it may not be doesn't mean that tomorrow's there's going to be another limiting factor. And I think Kirtland's warbler is a really good example of that. We did an amazing thing identifying what was limiting that species on the breeding grounds, and now all of a sudden, what's limiting that species may be in an entirely different geography that is the non-breeding season. So going around that constant effort of going around the wheel again to assess where we are is really important. And limiting factors really makes that obvious. Finally, yeah, stressing that I think your question about what the bar is for identifying what a limiting factor is and then beginning to do something about it is really important. I think thinking that for a while, these will be hypotheses. And so adaptive research that involves actually addressing the limiting factor, not just sort of doing something and seeing if it works, is really important because then you're kind of like assessing the effectiveness of the conservation action that you're implementing to address the limiting factor at the same time as you're looking at the limiting factor and seeing if it really is a limiting factor. So understanding the interplay of all those approaches is really important.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think it's why the I'll go see if I can go backwards. It's why number 5 for landscape challenges is looking at how are these campaigns already being addressed? Who's doing this work? What are they doing? So then when you get to the point of feeling good enough about identifying this limiting factor for the species to be ready to try some conservation action, that doesn't mean starting from the ground independently as a species working group, but it's ideally tying in to conservation work that's happening and saying, we've identified that this could be tweaked and it could have a big impact on this bird species within your existing efforts to address this threat. Or, could this campaign expand to include X and Y in addition to Z? And being aware of the work that's happening and where those opportunities are to plug into it saves having to start writing a grant proposal to do a conservation delivery project that you can assess. And I think being able to operate that way too allows for this adaptive approach to be more possible, because we're conserving resources as much as possible, and allowing for partnerships and collaborations and flexibility in approaches. Other thoughts from anyone on how your working group is? You don't have to answer our questions, but how your working group is kind of moving through this process. I think one of our goals with the progression of the wheel, is that without a plan that's an integrated conservation plan that thinks about partnerships, that thinks about full annual cycle conservation and human dimensions, then you might get to the point of finally having the data that Ken's referring to and feeling really strong about what it means, and then having to think about the other pieces. And I think it's Road to Recovery's hope that by using a process like this, we expedite getting to action, for species recovery, so that by, while part of the working group is working on the data and the modeling and doing, the hard work in the field, the working group membership has been expanded to, there's a subcommittee focusing on partnerships, and there's, all this other stuff is happening in the background so that as a team, the pieces can come together when it's most opportunistic based on what everyone is learning. So we'll move forward, and this was just kind of where my mind was in wrapping up this section of the wheel is that we've talked about some of these things. There are a lot of components, and I know there's different frameworks that help to prioritize action, right? Once we're getting the pieces in place that we need, how do we prioritize decisions? And there's so many factors. I talked a bit about the feasibility of the human dimensions component. I like the word feasibility, and I also use the term social suitability a lot in my own work, looking at how do you, when you know what you need to do or want to do from a conservation perspective, how do you identify communities where that would work? Those communities are well set up without any extra capacity building to engage in that conservation. And where are they not? And if they're not, what do they need? How do we do those capacity assessments? Those pieces, I'm working kind of from the bottom up here, but those pieces can impact prioritization. We ideally can prioritize for bird species recovery by what's most important for the recovery of the bird populations, right? Which actions are going to have the most positive impact on that species population growth, right? Or stopping the decline first, I guess, and then reversing it is what our goal is with all of these bird species. But I think the reality of conservation is we have to be opportunistic sometimes. And so some of these other components might play in to the prioritization of what conservation actions we can take. And they're as concrete as opportunities and funding. You explore a partnership with an organization that's working on the ground and they're open to collaborating. And so maybe you seize that opportunity even though you haven't maybe reached the threshold of certainty with your data that you would like, but the opportunity and the resources are there. So we move forward. I think always around the wheel, the goal is this adaptive conservation planning in that we are, I don't think we have the luxury with many of these species of waiting. And so how do we make the decisions, right? Like I said, where's that bar of certainty? Where is it that we feel really certain, but where is it that it's certain enough to move forward? And I think trying to share examples of those whenever possible, and how groups have made those decisions and then adapted as they've learned more could be really beneficial for our community here to share and learn from and see, because all of these pieces are important to the puzzle, and they're all going to play a role differently at different times. So I think having some, we've been thinking a lot within Road to Recovery about what supplemental pieces can we provide to go along with this wheel. Last time we talked about a focal area profile, kind of a template for developing that. Some sort of like prioritization mapping template would be really interesting to be able to share with each other of, this is what we had and this is the decision we made because of these factors, so that we can kind of collectively learn what's working in our decision making. Thoughts, questions, comments? We're down to 2 minutes. I always talk too much, but these are really interesting topics, and I hope it's our hope that by the end of this series of 6, working groups will have access to, you already have access to the wheel, but to these descriptions as well, and more groups can work through that wheel, because I think there's a lot of benefit for us collectively if we have several of them to look at and compare. We'll kind of move towards those applications as we wrap up the forums on the wheel. So next, I said I would come back to this, and I almost forgot, but here it is. Moving forward, the next session in June moves on to action category 5, which is strategize recovery. And so we'll be looking at kind of how all of this work in sections 3 and 4 to move towards identifying limiting factors can then move into developing a strategy for recovery. and how we kind of can move into that section, I think, while still working on the rest and moving in cycles through those other sections as more data and more opportunities are gained. So we have accomplished our goals for today. Our next section that I just mentioned is on June 18th. It's the same link for this one. So if you registered for this session, you will receive reminders for the next one as well. Feel free to share these with your working group. And as always, if your working group has worked through the wheel, Road to Recovery would love to see a copy of it. If you're having working sessions as a working group and are choosing to use the wheel, and don't mind any of us sitting in, we love to join those sessions and just hear how it's working and what the brainstorming is sounding like with different groups, so that we can continue to tailor this tool to be as useful as possible for species working groups. We are right at 4 o'clock, so we will wrap up. Thank you all for joining today. We have a webinar, our R2R announcements, which I also almost forgot. Many of you have heard we are hiring a new executive director. So we are looking for new leadership moving forward for this initiative. And that job description and posting is linked on our Road to Recovery website. We also continue our monthly webinar series next month on June 8th. The registration link for the webinar is also on our website. Thank you all so much. Great to see you. Talk to you soon.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Katie, and the whole group.
Thank you. Good to see everyone.